Good evening. This is the International Report produced by Internews. I'm Garrett. Tonight we have a special program on the 26th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. With me tonight are two Americans who were deeply involved in the developments in China during the 1930s and 40s prior to liberation, Jim White and John Service. Jim White went to China in 1932 as an exchange student to Yenching University. Later he taught English and journalism at Yenching, and from 1936 to 1941 he was an Associated Press reporter in Peking. After a stay in Washington during the war, Jim returned to China for several months in 1948 and 49 during the last days of the nationalist regime. John Service was born and raised in West China, in the West China province of Tituan, by his missionary parents. After attending Oberlin College, he returned to China in 1935 and was commissioned a Foreign Service officer. He traveled widely, going to the field to report for the embassy on everything from what warlords and the price of rice to the Chinese Communist Party, which was his specialty. In July 1944, he had the rare opportunity to travel to Yan'an, the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party, as part of the U.S. Army Observer Section dubbed the Dixie Mission. Jack spent several months in Yan'an observing life in the communist areas, holding many discussions with communist leaders, including Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, Lin Piao, and Chen Yi. You can correct me on pronunciations. And on the basis of his observations and interviews, Jack made reports and policy recommendations to the U.S. government. He warned of the dangers of the U.S. policy of supporting only the Chiang Kai-shek regime during the war against Japan and in the coming renewed civil war in China. Jack's prophetic reports, about half of which have now been collected in a paperback, Lost Chance in China, were ammunition used against him in the McCarthy period and even earlier in the right-wing campaign to find a scapegoat for America's failure in China. Jack returned to China in 1971, and again this year when Jack and Caroline Service spent 3 months in Peking and then touring many areas of China. So maybe we just start. Jim, maybe you can describe what it was like to be in China in the mid-1930s. What were the conditions? What was the maybe a little the contrast between what it was like for workers and peasants and what it was like for KMT officials and commercial interests?
Yes, I think that most of us were impressed by two things. One was the vast difference between the controlling classes and the peasants. The standard of living of the people, the vast majority of the people, was abysmally low. And there was really a very small, minuscule bourgeois element between them and the what would be called the ruling class. And the ruling class generally was a very rich ruling class because it was very small. The wealth was very concentrated. The other thing I think that most of us remember was the fact that the Japanese were invading and that nobody was really doing anything about it. I think the strategy of the nationalist government was to stall and to get this country involved as much as it could, and in that sense they succeeded. But they weren't doing anything about the Japanese invaders, and it remained for the communists to really make an appeal to the people and get it across on the basis of resistance to the Japanese.
What was it like sitting in Peking in terms of the way the communists were presented, the image in both as a reporter and just for the average person in Peking?
Yeah, well, during that period, the campaigns against the communists were going forward in Jiangxi and other provinces in south and central China, and when we had vague stories and reports about great massacres of the masses of the people who were rallying around the communists, but never very much confirmation. And so it came as considerable enlightenment to most people when Ed Snow actually visited the red areas in 1935 and 36 and came back with something like a realistic story. I remember one thing that was very characteristic of that time. The Kuomintang officials of the central government, usually through the Central News Agency, periodically put out reports that Mao Zedong had been killed in battle, or Zhou Enlai had been killed in battle, or Lin Biao, or Zhu De, or Peng Dehuai, you name it, any general. Was almost every month at least, some communist general was killed in battle. And of course, there was never any confirmation. And it got to the point where actually one communist general was killed in battle, a man named Liu Zedong. And nobody believed it, just like they didn't believe any of the other reports. And it wasn't until years later that we found out that Liu Zedong actually had been killed.
Well, what was the impact at this time of Ed Snow's reports?
Well, it had a tremendous impact, because here was a man who'd actually gone there and come back, and Ed was well known, he was respected, honest man, and people believed him, especially the Chinese. It had a tremendous effect on them. It was quickly translated into Chinese and pirated, of course. I mean, the book had to be distributed more or less underground in Chinese, as I understand it.
How were the communists being presented in the U.S. press at this time?
Well, I wasn't here, but I did see some American magazines at that time, and it was not as twisted as one might expect. It was simply that they didn't take the communists very seriously. They didn't realize what a tremendous advance the Chinese communists had made in working out a formula to appeal to the masses of the people.
Right. Well, John, of course, you traveled all over China, and maybe you'd like to comment a bit on the conditions that you saw, before you went to Yan'an in the KMT and the Japanese occupied areas.
Well, conditions in the Kuomintang controlled areas can only be described as very bad. They didn't have any system of rationing. They had a very cruel and corrupt system of conscription. The war was very unpopular. The troops really supported themselves by robbing the people, the areas in which they were stationed. And by 1944, it was perfectly clear to the people in Chongqing, the Kuomintang, that in effect the United States was going to win the war, and they were simply sitting things out. There was tremendous inflation. This bred corruption in every sphere, because it encouraged people to hoard and to buy up goods, which raised prices even more. You could make more money by hanging on to commodities such as cotton yarn than you could by manufacturing into cloth and things like that. And it was a sort of a vicious circle, the whole life in China.
On this question of inflation, we now hear about the reports that seem so outrageous in Chile, for example, 400% a year, but the time period you're talking about is even vastly greater inflation than that, isn't it?
Oh, vastly greater. I forget, of course, by the time it ended, the inflation rate was measured in millions, but by the time that I'm talking about, it was something like 400 or 500 times what it had been pre-war, because the government was supporting itself by its own printing presses and by buying money which was printed in America and flown over the hump.
Bringing in supplies. Well, were you able to visit any of the Japanese occupied areas? I imagine that would be rather difficult for an American.
No, although people who were with the Dixie Mission, of course, went behind the Japanese lines into North China. They went all the way across North China to quite close to Peking. Behind the Japanese lines, of course, they had to cross railways that were held by the Japanese and things like that. But although I was quite eager, I was told to stay in Yan'an and maintain contact with the communist leaders who were in Yan'an at that time. Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai and the rest of the leaders there.
Well, maybe we should talk then about sort of the contrast from going from the Kuomintang areas into Yan'an. What was, I know that it must be quite a contrast, and be real interesting to hear about.
Yes, Banning, it was sort of a contrast almost between night and day, or black and white, or whatever you want to call it. I think the contrast that surprised us most, and we really didn't know what to expect. Of course, when we went up, we'd read books like Ed Snow's Red Star Over China, and there had been other people that had gotten into Yan'an in 1938 and 39, but it had been completely blockaded by the Kuomintang since 39, so there had been 5 years of isolation. And of course, reports and so on filtered through, and there were Chinese Communist representatives in Chongqing, and we heard some things from them, but we tended to discount those as being sort of partial and prejudiced. So we really didn't have an idea of what to expect when we got to Yan'an, and I think what really surprised us most was the tremendous air of confidence. They had almost nothing in the way of material things. They had nothing in the way of arms. They'd received no equipment from us or from the Kuomintang or from the Soviet Union. Their arms were mostly what they could capture from the Japanese or manufacture themselves. Very simple. The life was very simple. They were living on millet and things like that. But the confidence that they were on the winning side, that they were going ahead, was simply staggering. And furthermore, their whole emphasis was on doing something. In Chongqing, as I mentioned before, it was on sitting and waiting. In Yan'an, they realized that they were getting stronger as the war went on. As they opposed the Japanese and took territory and towns away from the Japanese, it expanded their own areas, made them stronger. So the whole emphasis was on action, on doing something. And of course, this is just what we wanted. We at that time, we were fighting in Japan. And this was wonderful, wonderful stuff, to see somebody that was willing to get in there and do something.
Well, Vaughn, in a minute we maybe can turn to U.S. policy with regards to the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, but maybe go on more on the sort of life in the areas in terms of just human relationships between leaders and and might see the masses of people among men and women, that kind of thing. Particularly coming from a very hierarchical and authoritarian society and on the other side, and very strong class divisions with people. What were your impressions in the communist areas?
Well, this again impressed us very much because there was so little pomp and ceremony. They used to have dances every Saturday night over in an orchard, a peach orchard at party headquarters. There was a sort of a makeshift orchestra, partly Chinese instruments, partly Western, mostly out of tune. We'd play, they would play a foxtrot and then a waltz and then a Chinese sort of adaptation of Chinese folk dance called the Yangge. And it was quite a thing to see Chairman Mao and Zhu De, sort of a bear, a great big man who was the commander-in-chief of the communist armies. There were more men than ladies, but the ladies used to take the initiative if they felt like it, and you'd see a nurse from the International Peace Hospital go up and ask Chairman Mao for a dance, and he would smile and get up and dance with her, and so on. And we all thought this was great sport. But if Chairman Mao wanted to come and see us, he just came to see us. There may have been a security man somewhere in the background, but he was never obvious. But you might have anybody from the whole Communist Party walk into the little sort of compound where our Dixie Mission group was stationed. We were about 30 people, I suppose, and sit down for a talk and maybe stay for a meal and then walk on home. It was a small village, sort of a little bit like a church summer conference, some religious group. Everyone was very friendly to everyone else. There was no sort of fancy living for anybody. And they didn't say, they say brother, they said comrade, of course, but there was no using of fancy titles.
Did the officers, for example, wear marks distinguishing them from the troops?
No. But you could usually tell, which I think that they probably had the same system then as that they do now, that enlisted man has 2 pockets on his jacket, and officer has 4 pockets on his jacket. You can easily count, you know.
What's the difference between a lieutenant and a general?
No.
No more pockets, huh?
No. And as a matter of fact, in those days, a general might be quite young. Lin Biao himself was a pretty young man in those days. So that you couldn't tell by the gray hairs whether a man was a general or not.
What was your impression of Mao and Zhou Enlai and the leaders themselves?
Well, Mao was obviously the first among equals, and they all were very equal and open, frank among themselves. I think Mao was a very, very impressive person. He had some habits, very noticeably, of usually letting other people, if you were in a group or a meeting discussion, he would encourage other people to talk, draw them out. Very often he would be the man to sort of sum up, which he would do in a very, very competent way of summarizing the views or expressing his sort of conclusion. Zhou Enlai is much more sort of tense, much more dramatic, much quicker, sharper in his reactions in his conversation. Chairman Mao is rather serene, rather calm, rather sits back and lets you say, and then he will say. He doesn't interrupt and stop you. Zhou Enlai is apt to sort of jump in if he sees a point that he can take advantage of or he wants to emphasize. Zhu De was just a kindly old farmer, just very, very pleasant, very, very friendly. Chinese have different, shall we say, different social customs, and it's quite common in China to see men holding hands, and I've sat the whole evening to a theatrical performance with Zhu De holding my hand, which I was embarrassed about at first, but then realized was nothing to be embarrassed about. But he's just a very kindly person. When he used to talk about the communist ideas of guerrilla warfare, we're the fish, the people of the sea, and how we must depend on the people and so on, you could see his eyes shine. I mean, this was something that he really believed in, something that he was convinced of. Lin Biao was a much colder person, and he said many of the same things, but he said them in a rather matter-of-fact, rather calm way. In other words, his eyes didn't shine. You realize that he was saying these things because this was the only practical way they could operate. Somebody like Zhu De was doing it because this is right. And there was a very marked contrast. Chen Yi, of course, is dead now. He was the commander of the new Fourth Army, volatile, liked to talk, a bit of a spinner of yarns, very good fun. He was a fellow provincial of mine. He was also born in Tituan, and he actually had known my father slightly, the YMCA in Chengdu, where he probably learned ping pong like a lot of other Chinese did. Holung was a bluff, hearty person. Peng Dehuai was the same sort of a bluff person. Nirong Zhen, who now is the head of the atomic energy, at that time was the head of the Jinchaji area, had studied in France, a real gentleman. But they were a very, very impressive group of leaders in every way.
What would you say they had in common? I mean, you've described very individual personalities and types of reactions.
Well, they obviously had something in common, which was tremendously important, and that was a vision of a new China. They were all members of the party. They had given their lives, most of their adult lives, to their party, underground, fighting in Jiangxi, the Long March. These men were all, most of them on the Long March. Chen Yi, for instance, had been left behind to fight a rearguard action and keep resistance alive in Jiangxi. But the rest of them had gone through a great deal together, but they were convinced that they could bring about a new future for the people of China, and it was, as I said earlier, a faith that gave them just an incredible sense of confidence.
One of the things that strikes me in reading your dispatches is that a person not too familiar with China might think that on the one hand you have people who might have a very almost parochial sense about their particular area or whatever in China, not have tremendous knowledge. On the other hand, tremendously abstract theories. But in fact, from reading your dispatches, you get the impression from Mao's interviews that here's a man with a tremendous practical sense and realistic sense about the world, tremendous knowledge about even the United States, about the Soviet Union, about basically the world situation, a real grasp of it and an ability to comprehend its subtleties.
It was quite surprising, and this is another thing that surprised us. Here they had been holed up in North China they'd arrived there in '36, and this was 8 years later, with no contact with the outside world. But the radio, of course, was available to them, and it's a great thing. And they picked up news from the world, and they got newspapers, of course, from Chongqing and the Guomindang area, and they also got magazines and newspapers from the Japanese-occupied cities. And books were scarce, but they treated them as very valuable and preserved them carefully. And they did know a good deal about the world, more than we had expected them to know.
Maybe it'd be interesting for people to hear about what the life had, how life had changed for the average person in these areas, which of course would be mostly peasants and and maybe merchants, etc., in these vast areas that had been liberated by the Communist Party, but of course were so inaccessible practically to anyone else from the outside.
Well, it's a little hard to generalize on that, because so many of the areas were subject to Japanese attacks, Japanese raids, Japanese campaigns. In other words, most of the areas they held were guerrilla areas, and there was active warfare going on, perhaps every year, once or twice, or sometimes not for 2 years, but they were attacked several times during the war. And of course this brought tremendous suffering, destruction. The Japanese campaigns were ruthless against the guerrillas. They had a campaign of destroy all, burn all, and so on. This raised morale. It gave they gave the people something to fight for, and they found out that the communists were willing to fight for them, were on their side, which is something new in China. They weren't used to armies that acted that way in China, and so there was a tremendous sort of morale against the Japanese, militant morale in most of the communist-held areas. And then there was a great deal done also to help the peasants in the way of reducing taxes, reducing land rents, of encouraging production in every way they could, because these areas were blockaded both by the Japanese and the Kuomintang, and they had to be self-sufficient. So there was a lot of propaganda and energy and incentives to developing production, so that most of these areas were relatively quite prosperous, more prosperous than we had expected, and the peasants and farmers are better off than they were in the Kuomintang areas, by and large, and despite the war.
Did the communists give the peasants a kind of confidence that it really had been lacking among the peasantry anyway in China for so many centuries? Yeah,
well, it wasn't so much that the peasants in Kuomintang China had lacking confidence as just being ignored. They were simply regarded as a force there to be exploited, to be forced to produce grain, to be forced to produce conscripts. They were never brought into the war. They were never given any feeling that this war was their war, that they had an interest in fighting it. And of course this was very different in the communist areas, and it was easier for the communists to be perfectly blunt about it because the Japanese were there. They were much closer. In the Kuomintang areas, the enemy was far away, and how could the poor Chinese peasant visualize? But if the Japanese had actually raided your village and grabbed your wheat and burned your house and raped your wife, why, you had the personal stake in the war that, to be honest, was lacking in a lot of the Kuomintang areas.
One of the things that I think most Americans probably aren't really aware of is that, contrary to the impression that, I think most people realize that the Chinese Communist Party was no puppet of Moscow, but I think it was only in 1972 that it came out that at this period, Mao, in 44-45 during the war, Mao and Zhou Enlai offered to come to Washington to meet with President Roosevelt and discuss the common war effort, and really were much more open to relations and good relations with the United States than I think was ever given credit for publicly.
Well, that's quite true. The United States was tremendously important to them, and it was vital to them both in the war, during the war, and in the period after the war, to find out what American policy was and how they stood with the United States. They were confused, quite understandably, because when the Dixie mission was sent to Yan'an in July 1944, it was thought that if the communist forces could be useful, that we would try to cooperate with them and bring them into the war effort. Thinking in Washington apparently changed. Patrick J. Hurley was sent out to China and then eventually became ambassador, and he was convinced that the most important American objective was to support and maintain the position of Chiang Kai-shek. And so he changed the whole attitude in thinking about the possibility of cooperating with the communists. It couldn't be thought of, he said, unless Chiang Kai-shek was going to agree, and obviously Chiang Kai-shek was not going to agree to the Americans supporting his most bitter enemy and rivals for power. So by the beginning of 1945, the communists were really perplexed and worried. And this was the period when they asked, when they put out feelers, to see whether or not President Roosevelt would let them come to the States so they could find out from the horse's mouth, so to speak, as just to what American policy really was, because it was very mixed up at that time.
Well, the policy as it evolved, correct me if I'm wrong, was to continue to support Chiang Kai-shek, and in fact, really even the way the war ended, to aid Chiang's troops in occupying the areas that the Japanese had occupied after they were defeated, and to, what was it, something like over $2 billion in military equipment eventually went to the Kuomintang by 49, and to, although Atchison and the Truman government was attacked for not having gone all out to save China. In fact, as Atchison defends himself, if you want to call it defending, they did go all out to do everything they could, short of a military intervention by U.S. troops, which, of course, in retrospect of Vietnam, you can imagine what it would be like with 800 million or whatever, 600 million Chinese people to fight against at that time. So that the policy did become clear, and an opportunity, as I think you foresaw it yourself at that time, to play a very different role in the future of China. And of course, China, the world might have been quite different in terms of Korea and Vietnam if the U.S. had in fact played a neutral role and not encouraged the civil war, not encouraged what you saw as to be a completely losing attempt by Chiang to try to crush the Communist Party. There was no way they could do it, and to back that was a disaster, because I believe, as you wrote, it would only lead to forcing the communists away from the United States, and of course be a defeat in the process as well.
Well, that's quite correct. What was back of American policy, the formation of American policy at that time, I think has never been completely explained. We simply don't know the answers. Apparently, it's related to the American concern to have Russia participate in the war against Japan. And apparently also, I think, in Roosevelt's mind, the desirability of trying to build a basis for some Russian-American post-war cooperation, sort of a détente with the Soviet Union. At any rate, in February 1945, at Yalta, of course, President Roosevelt secretly gave away Chinese rights and prerogatives in Manchuria, and in return got a promise from Stalin that he would support only the central government. This was a secret agreement. Even the State Department didn't know about it until months later. We in China, of course, didn't know about it. But this obviously is part of the background of the decision to have nothing whatever to do with the Chinese communists, since we had gotten Stalin to agree that he would have nothing to do with anyone except the central government.
Well, Jim, maybe you could just briefly describe what it was like to be back in China in 48 and 49, the last days of the dying gasps of the Kuomintang.
Yes, I went back in the autumn of 1948, after it became obvious that Jinan had fallen and Manchuria had gone earlier and so on. It was obvious that it was just a question of time and terms before the whole thing collapsed. And I was never able to get up into the communist-controlled areas, but I did visit Shanghai, Nanking, Canton, and Taipei. And in spite of the euphoria that always persists around a national capital like Nanking, it was perfectly obvious that everyone was just stalling. I mean, just biding their time, trying to figure out how to get out, what's the best thing to do, how can we save this, that, and the other. And people were leaving in droves for Taiwan already. And I actually, and at the same time, I think that one thing that made nationalist morale collapse faster than anything else was was it gold yuan at that time that the nationalist government floated. They revalued the currency, got the what small bourgeois class there was in places like Shanghai to invest in this, to turn in their old currency and buy the new currency, and then it took the lid off and inflation went off again at a great gallop, and it was almost as bad as it had been before the war. And that really finished the nationalists, in my opinion, on the mainland, in addition to all the other factors that were at work. I interviewed a couple of bankers, one in Shanghai and one in Canton, Chinese bankers. And they actually pounded on the table, both of them, without my encouraging them in any way. I mean, I was just asking them, what do you think about the communists? What are you going to do? They said, let them come on. It can't possibly be any worse than things already are. Because they'd seen their own clients cheated out of their life savings and that sort of thing. And it was one more blow too many.
It just reached a point of complete rot.
Right. Yeah.
Well, maybe in the last part of the program, we only have a few minutes left, but Jack, you can describe what it's like in China today. What are the changes over a 30, 40-year period that you can see now after spending, 2 visits, 3 months the last time, traveling almost to one end of China to the other?
Well, I think to someone who lived in China in the sort of bad old days, I lived there from 1909 on, shall we say, through 1945 pretty much. The thing that hits you, strikes you when you come to China now is that you come to a country that is unified, that it's a going concern, it's a modern state. This is a feeling you never had in the old China. The warlord China was split up and separate, and the government in Peking or Nanking, where it was, had no real power, governed only a part of it. But now you know right away that you're coming to a country that really has become a country. This and many other things are responsible for a whole new attitude of the people, a spirit. They obviously had a tremendous experience in political movements and political training in the campaigns they've gone through. But it's certainly the part what's happened to China is a part of what gives people, when you see them on the street, an air of confidence, of self-respect. Inside the country, there is a new spirit of egalitarianism. Certainly, the top leaders have their motor cars and they live in a better house and so on. They've got perquisites. But in dress and in manner and in approach to other people, there's a surprising equality which wasn't there before. No one has any need to be servile or humble or obsequious. The man who waits on you in the hotel dining room or that looks after your room, he talks to you straight and direct as man to man in a way that you would never meet in China in the old days. Of course, the obvious things that people speak about, people are better clothed, better fed, no more beggars, no more poverty, streets are clean, and so on. But I think it's a real change that's more deep than that in China. The fact that in the old days perhaps 10% of people were educated, were literate. Nowadays it's probably just reversed. Probably 90% are literate, and the only illiterates are quite old people who never had a chance to go to school. But all the children go to school now. And it's been a tremendous job of the country. 600 million or 800 million or perhaps even 900 million, no one knows.
Well, what was it like to meet some of your old friends like Zhou Enlai when you met him again in 1971 after all those years? Had he changed? What was your impression of that meeting?
Yes, of course he changed. He was 26 or 7 years older. But also, when you've been in a position of power, as he has, it obviously leaves some changes, some marks. I don't mean that these are unpleasant, but he obviously now is a person who is used to having his words given great weight and having people jump when he's asked for something and so on. If he says something now, it's done very quickly. It's very different from the informal days of Yan'an. But the sharpness, the mental alertness, the sort of rapier-like quickness of mind is still there. I was very impressed in 71. Of course, I didn't see him in 75 because his health is too bad. He's not able to see very many people now. In fact, recently, apparently, he seems to be seeing even fewer people. Most of my other friends are very old now, or very high, very hard to see. Chairman Mao only sees a few people, usually visiting chiefs of state. Some have died, like Chen Yi, Dung Bi Wu. I went to a memorial service for him while I was there. We did see Madame Sun Yat-sen, my wife and I, and that was a very pleasant reunion. I hadn't seen her since Chongqing, 1944 and 45.
Is she well?
She's fairly well. She had had a fall, and she was walking with a cane and some assistance, but her spirit's quite good.
Did you know Deng Xiaoping?
No, I didn't know Deng Xiaoping. I don't think that he was in Yan'an. I think that he was left behind to sort of be in charge. He was their deputy to Chen Yi, and since Chen Yi was in Yan'an, who they were waiting for the party congress, I believe that Deng Xiaoping was still in the new Fourth Army area.
So you have no particular perspective on him?
No acquaintance with Deng Xiaoping.
What was it like to return to your old home in Tituan?
Well, it was very nice. Actually, Chengdu, which is where I was born and lived until I was about 10, I didn't really have as sharp memories of as I did of Chongqing, where I spent 4 years during the war. I think probably going back to Chongqing and seeing the house where I lived there during the war with Saul Adler and so on of the Treasury Department, I think that was probably more fun than going to Chongqing. Going to Chengdu, I mean.
Quite a few changes.
Oh, a great many changes.
Right. Well, I think that this is a good place to end the program, the interview. This is Ben and Garrett of Internews. I've been talking with Jim White and Jack Service about China, and this has been the International Report.